Ron, I'm an addict. And I was asked to do a history presentation. I thought, let me try to do something that has never been done. That is not a history of some things that have never been kind of pointed out before. So that's what I've been working on. Okay, so here's what I'm going to focus on. Some of this has been done, but let me just show you. We're going to look a little bit at the pre-NA environment. We're going to kind of try to draw a through line from where things kind of started in NA, and then kind of how we sort of differentiated ourselves from AA and what that was like and what some of the stuff that we had to sort of work out was. So I will look at the birth of NA in the early years. I'm going to look at sometimes the question comes up, why the hell did we get 6 editions, if you include 3rd edition revised, of the basic text in 6 years? So I'm going to just touch that story and give you the highlights of that. But this is where I'm going to do the deep dive. The impact of our first step, and what in the 80s was often called the NA philosophy of recovery. And it seems like that phrase has kind of been lost but that phrase was being bandied around a lot in the 80s. Like, what the NA philosophy of recovery, how do we catch it? What language is appropriate for it? What language confuses it? That sort of stuff. So we're kind of going to go down that track and say, what was underlying that issue? Share a few of my own personal experiences. I'm going to try to stay out of that a little bit, sort of opposite of what you'd normally do at the podium, but talk a little bit about some of my personal experiences. If I happen to be in the room and have some interesting observations to share, I'll do some of that. But for the most part, it's not about me up here. And NA worldwide, I'll just do kind of like a slideshow and show you kind of, at some point, where did it all lead? Okay. So getting to those pre-1953 milestones, the first one is, and you'll hear me rushing a little bit because I've timed this, and I got to move in order to get it in an hour and a half. In the history of Narcotics Anonymous, the first milestone is the founding of Alcoholics Anonymous, right? That we obviously, sometimes we don't say it out loud enough, but obviously we borrowed their steps, we borrowed their traditions, we borrowed many things. If you've been at GSR, we got that idea from them, the idea of the service structure. So let's just give credit where credit's due. That's the first milestone in the history of Narcotics Anonymous, as far as I'm concerned. This is another one of some, not quite the same level of importance, but this one was also interesting. This is the opening of the Federal Narcotics Hospital in Lexington, Kentucky. There's influences that came out of that place that got to us and were part of our founding too. So I'm just going to kind of draw that line a little bit as well. Publishing of the AA Big Book. So why do you talk about the publishing of the AA Big Book and an NA history? Because for 30 years, from 1953 to 1983, that was the NA basic text. Not officially, never officially, but just never questioned either. Of course you use the Big Book, you read the Big Book, and for the most part, everywhere. The people who wrote the basic text, what was their book? Was that book? So it's just, again, looking at the reality of our history, we sort of emerged from AA in some way, differentiated ourselves, and that's kind of the story I want to tell. 1941, the Jack Alexander article. This was an article in the Saturday Evening Post that described AA for America. It is hard to get the impact of the Saturday Evening Post from where we sit today with the internet and television and radio and podcasts. And that thing was on everybody's coffee table in the country, and it was like a big deal, And so when AA first got started, it was a well-kept secret. Nobody knew anything about it. They tried to get some movement. They had a warehouse full of big books, but nothing was moving until that article. And then shit exploded. People read about it, and they started getting all these requests. And so you could really kind of put the emergence on the scene of AA as 1941 with the Jack Alexander article. And then the last one I'm going to mention is the formal adoption of the traditions. And look at the year there, 1950. They were working on them. Bill was writing articles for the Grapevine. It was throughout the 40s, throughout maybe the last half of or most of the 40s. But they actually adopted them in 1950. Just have that in your mind. It's going to be significant in a second. So this is the 15-year period in which our predecessors' hard-won experience gave birth to the traditions. Our predecessors, that the basic text is referencing there, is those guys, right? Because it wasn't our hard-won experience that gave birth to the traditions. It was our predecessors. So let's look at some of those predecessors, starting with this guy. First known person to achieve sustained recovery from addiction to drugs in addition to alcohol through Alcoholics Anonymous. He was admitted to Lexington in 1939 for morphine addiction. So he goes to the narcotics hospital in Lexington for morphine addiction. And notice I have the word also in quotes there. He's also an alcoholic. Because that was the way it was considered then. That's the way it's still considered in some places by some people. An addict is one thing and an alcoholic is another. And of course, you know where I'm going with this story. And then they always say, no, that's one thing. That's an addict, and that's one drug, and that's another, right? But how did we get there? That's kind of the interesting story I want to focus on here. In 1944, Tom M. writes to Lexington suggesting that they start an AA group for addicts in there. So throughout this time, this is 1944 now. So I said Jack Alexander happened in 1941. So like 3 years into the explosion of AA, they're already saying, addicts are already knocking on the door. And what kind of reception did they get? That's some of the story we're going to talk about here too. This guy, Houston, he's kind of, I would say, massive in terms of a predecessor to Narcotics Anonymous. His job took him to Lexington, Kentucky in 1946, and he was one of these H&I kind of guys. So he's busy carrying the message into hospitals and that sort of stuff. So he approached this narcotics forum in his new city about starting an AA-like group for addicts. And he gets permission to do that and starts what he calls Addicts Anonymous there on February 16th, 1947. So that's Addicts Anonymous in Lexington. Danny C. is among the first patients admitted to Lexington. Look at the year, 1935. Same year that AA was founded, same year that the narcotics hospital was created. This guy, Danny, walks into this hospital and becomes their patient. He goes in and out, though, 7 times in the next 12 years, unable to stay clean. Because that's what dope fiends do, right? They don't stay clean. They let them out, they use, they come back. You let them out, they use, they come back. 1947, he attends Addicts Anonymous in Lexington. So Danny attends Addicts Anonymous in Lexington, and he's mentored by Houston. He gets up in 1948 and attends Alcoholics Anonymous. So, lives happily ever after, right? That's the end of the story. He relapses in 1948 after attending AA, and it ends up right back to working with Houston in Lexington. But in April of 1949, he returns to New York City and starts a meeting for addicts based on the AA program and calls it Narcotics Anonymous. So look at the year, 1949. So we're talking about 1953 all the time. So why is that? And we're going to go down that trail today. This is the first use of the name Narcotics Anonymous. Danny never used again. So Danny started his own thing, called it Narcotics Anonymous. So then why don't we say 1949? There's some who argue we should. And here's what that organization looked like. So by New York City NA, founded in 1949. By this, I mean Danny C's organization in New York City, a spin-off of Addicts Anonymous out of Lexington. It was founded pre-traditions. Remember I said the traditions were adopted by AA in 1950. Danny's organization was founded pre-traditions and never adopted them. So the interesting thing here is we're going to see what it looks like when you do us without traditions. Right? Okay, and let's not disparage Danny. Danny was a rock star. Danny was fantastic. He came out of this place and he went to work. But they were directly affiliated with the Salvation Army, so you're looking for a way to kind of establish yourself. He directly affiliated his organization with the Salvation Army. They took public advocacy positions regarding addiction treatment and correspondence and interviews. So trying to persuade people about what we would think of as outside issues, which they wouldn't have done the Salvation Army thing had they had a sixth tradition. I'm using a little parentheses that way. They wouldn't have done the public advocacy about addiction stuff if they had a 10th tradition. They sought and accepted funding. Of course you would. You're trying to create a nonprofit. You're looking for where's our funding, so they did that, which they would have been guided not to do if they had a 7th tradition. They publicly identified Danny as the leader. And they wouldn't have done that had they had a 2nd and an 11th tradition. They appeared in articles with full name and face. They wouldn't have done that. This picture you see on the screen was from the Saturday Evening Post when they got their article in the Saturday Evening Post. And so they appeared in articles with full name and face. That's the 11th tradition. Danny died in 1956, succeeded as executive director by a woman named Ray Lopez. And Ray died in 1972 and the organization died out. So without those kind of leaders doing those things, this organization died out. So did they make any contributions, though? Absolutely. Let's look at the contributions they made. First known fellowship to use the name Narcotics Anonymous. They did extensive PR. I think of this sort of, and I've heard Boyd and Chris say this too, that sort of this my words, I'd say the tortoise and the hare story between that organization and ours. Ours was the tortoise, by the way. 1950s all the way through the 50s, kind of one meeting, not making a big splash in the world. These guys made a big splash in the world right away. They did extensive PR, including being mentioned in major magazines and books, and in numerous local newspaper articles, eventually TV as well. I was reading something where Bill Wilson, someone asked him, have you ever heard of these guys, addicts? Or Danny Carlson, and he said, well, we've never met, but I saw him on television once. So there you go. That they were getting the PR. And here, what did I say the year of this one is? 1954. So a new approach to a tragic social problem, drug addiction, has been found by the ex-addicts of Narcotics Anonymous. So there we go. They're getting that kind of mention. We're not, put it that way. In retrospect, they provide a critical lesson in the importance of the traditions, and I would say that's their main contribution. That and that PR and getting the name out there. The Addicts Anonymous group in Lexington published something called The Key, which you can see evidence of both the New York group getting that, and obviously they were a direct. But you also see influence on the early members of our fellowship in The Key, coming from The Key, and I'll show you some of that. So here was the question, though, early on: will AA help addicts? If that would have worked out happily ever after, we wouldn't even be in this room. But they would have done their thing and just embraced us and figured that out. But I was saying, as soon as the doors open, addicts start knocking. So in June 1944, a letter appeared in the newly created AA Grapevine, proposing what they were calling a hopheads corner, a section where addicts could share experience with each other. And one thing you can trust with addiction, it's always going to be slang associated with it. And a series of Grapevine articles did appear in 44 and 45 on the topic, including warning of the dangers of goofballs. Now, goofballs, they're not talking about you, right? They're talking about that little pill you take with your drinks to give it that little extra ba-ba, And so, there's a question, though. If I have to stop drinking, do I have to stop the goofballs, too, Or can I do a goofball here or there still, So the issue of using while sober was emerging immediately. There are multiple questions. as an AA group for addicts. There were multiple suggestions of an AA group for addicts during this period. Tensions over this grow in AA. And by the early 50s, AA develops its singleness of purpose philosophy. Addicts can adapt the steps and traditions and form their own group, but not attend closed AA meetings as members. That was the policy. And so let's dig deeper now. Where did all that come from? And I'm going to show you a bunch of correspondence that Bill W. did with people wanting to apply AA to the problem of drug addiction throughout the 50s. And just a nod to Boyd and Chris on this first, that they actually went to the archives of AA in New York, and they did a search, and they found everything they could get their hands on where somebody was writing to Bill, and Bill was writing to them about starting a fellowship for addicts. Not just this one, but anyone. Like what's out there. So let's look at some of that correspondence. Bill wrote to Addicts Anonymous in Lexington, dated 1949, with the salutation, "Dear fellow sufferers, while I have no doubt that the underlying causes of alcohol and drug addiction are quite identical, it is a fact that the alcoholic feels himself quite a different, even superior creature. To make the score a tie," which is a beautiful Bill Wilsonism if you've read his stuff, "to make the score a tie, it's probably true that the average addict looks down on the alcoholic. In fact, I've seen that myself. Alcoholics and addicts are mutually exclusive and snobby." Now, Bill, this is kind of a fun little topic here, but Bill took this pretty seriously. Like, do we really want to bring that into AA? Not just those dope fiends, but that controversy. These people that don't really care much for each other. This was an often repeated message by Bill that appears in many of these communications. Betty Tom of HFD, or Habit Forming Drugs Group of AA in Los Angeles, wrote often, and she tried to persuade him to accept HFD groups forming within AA. He consistently resisted her idea. On March 13th of 1957, he wrote this: "Personally, I would feel glad that drug addicts seem free to go to open AA meetings, but I doubt if it'd be wise to encourage them to think they can actually become Alcoholics Anonymous members. In some spots, we've even had violent opposition to drug addicts attending AA open meetings." So Betty's proposed model was something more like a common needs meeting or a special interest meeting of AA. And Bill was always resistant to something like that, where you mix AA with something else. You go, no, we have a sixth tradition, we don't do that. Or maybe he wasn't saying sixth tradition yet at some points when he was saying that in the 40s. But she started her meeting in 54. This is Lynn now, Lynn of Montreal. And I want you to fall in love with Lynn like I have. She started her meeting in 1954 connected to Danny C's NA movement. So there was no bringing NA to Montreal from Los Angeles in the 50s. This was the Danny C people again. They had meetings all over the place. They had meetings in Los Angeles, but we'll get to that. So anyway, in the spring of 57, exchange of letters to Bill, she tries to persuade him to combine AA and NA into a program that would be inclusive of all drugs, including alcohol, and call it Addicts Anonymous. Can you imagine a harder sell than that? But here's the kind of shit Lynn was saying to Bill. An alcohol addict is still an addict. You know, like she was selling the NA message of 2025 to Bill. An alcohol addict is still an. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that alcoholism is addiction to alcohol. It is addiction that's the problem, not the chemical or the drug that the person is addicted to. 1950s. We have even changed the first step to say we admitted we were addicts. So she's taken that focus off the drug, the specific substance, and she's coming up with a way to say one thing that will apply to us all. Why? So that the addicted or newcomer may immediately associate himself with the program. I found that it's almost impossible to tell a man who has just laid down his hypodermic needle that his trouble is booze. Imagine. Instead, we worked from the angle that alcohol is a narcotic. Now, we went there too, right? We went there, but we worded it slightly different. But okay, but take a look at this. This was a little snip from her big book. Like so many people were doing it that time. They were taking the big book, getting it all typed out, and then putting one thing for another. But what I find interesting here is she said, we admitted we were powerless over drugs, and then thought better of it, scratched it out. We admitted we were powerless over, or we admitted we were addicts. She left the powerless thing out. But just interesting how different people did it. And by the way, Danny's powerless over drugs. Addicts Anonymous, powerless over drugs. Now here's where she starts kicking it in gear. But darn it, Bill, just try to see what I'm getting at for a second. I know too that you are only addicted to alcohol, so it's hard for you to see yourself as an addict. And being an alcoholic means your very life to you now. So I can see for myself right now that this is a hopeless cause, and I would not want to see anything happen to a bunch of alcoholics who insisted on being called alcoholics to recover. Using the word addict instead is all that it would be really required to throw the doors wide open for these hundreds of so-called junkers and habitual addicts. Honest to God, though. So, a few snips from Bill's response. I agree with all that you say on the first page about the basic nature of addiction. Right off the bat, that's pretty interesting. I agree with what you're saying about the basic nature of addiction. Please be sure of that. It's the same problem, and I have no doubt that the practice of the same principles and truths will help a vast area of it. Now, it's one thing to be right in the right time and way, and another to be right in the wrong time and way. To be right in the wrong time and way. We used to have a saying in Wall Street, nobody goes so broke as the man who's right at the wrong time. So what is he saying to her in 1957? He's saying, I get it, you're actually right, but are we going to... In 1957, how many years since the Big Book? 18 years the Big Book's been out and, changing the world, and it's all in place, and it's all written. They're focused, it's working. They don't want to kind of dilute it and make it weird. But he's saying, so the wrong way to do what you want to do is to make us do it. So what's the right way to do it? Okay, so let's keep going. Lynn's proposed model, AA and NA combined as Addicts Anonymous. Yeah, right. Okay. Jack P. of Los Angeles. Now this guy, if you haven't heard of this guy, this just could blow your socks off. I'm not wearing any, but it blew mine off when I saw this. Check this out. Jack was a member of Jimmy K's AA meeting in the San Fernando Valley doing institutional work in the county jail, another H&I kind of guy. They're all over our history. He was asked by the sheriff if he would do something like AA but for addicts. He agreed to try. At Jimmy's memorial in 1985, he spoke during the open mic saying that in 1952, he asked Jimmy for help in this. So we say 1953, right? He says in the basic text, July of 1953. This is the year before that. And Jack is asking Jimmy to get involved in his thing, which is called out Narcotics Anonymous, that he wants to do in the jail. So this was news in that room, in Jimmy's memorial. And the question in the room was this true? Nobody had heard of this guy. So I'm just going to tell one of those personal experience stories, because I was in that room. I attended Jimmy's memorial in 1985. It's not that sad, but it was a while ago. But I'll tell you, it just brings up the emotions. Sometimes just going back to those things. But so I was working for the World Service Office at that time. I had been brought on, less than a year before that, or no, about a year before that, to do some writing and editing for the fellowship and stuff. And so I'm, there at that memorial, and Bob Stone comes up to me after this. He comes right straight up to me, quick after this thing is over. He said, "Ron, get that guy's number, because we need to interview him. We need to find this story out. What's going on here?" So I did, and we did. We interviewed him. They assembled the whole board of trustees, and the whole board of trustees interviewed Jack, and he told his story. And then Bob wrote about it later in his book. Bob wrote a kind of a memoir/history book sometime after he was no longer working for us. And what he said in his book was, as much as I think the guy was sincere and honest, and I didn't doubt his honesty or anything, I kind of doubt his memory. I kind of doubt that this was the way it went down. It seems wrong. I can't find anyone else who will corroborate this. So the question is in the air, basically, is the way that Bob left that in his book. And then along came Chris and Boyd, who went to the archives of AA looking for letters, and they found this. He wrote to Bill in July of 1952, a full year before we say our fellowship was founded. We've been asked by the authorities of the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department to initiate a Narcotics Anonymous group. He names it in the Women's Division of the County Jail. The AA program and book are, I'm just stirred up a little bit. I saw my grandson do this week. He started to get worked up and went, I thought, well, that kid learned something that took me fucking 60 years. The AA program and book are concerned primarily with the rehabilitation of the alcoholic. However, because of the nature of the addict's addiction, it's reasonable to expect that the AA program could be of assistance to them. So here's the idea again. Can we do this for addicts? Both he and Bill, by the way, use the word narcotic for us. I'm Ron, I'm a narcotic. Instead of addict. So in order to avoid that distraction for these next couple slides, I'm going to use the word addict and put it in brackets like that. So you'll see. But just know they use. But it made me wonder about our name. Maybe that's how come our name is a little off. Like Narcotics Anonymous, a little bit odd, hard to translate. Doesn't mean like Alcoholics Anonymous kind of has a. So I wonder if because I'm Ron, I'm a narcotic. I don't know the answer to that, but I wonder. Because of this belief that this program could work for addicts, B and myself are taking the initial steps in preparing a program pointed towards the rehabilitation of the addict, one which we hope may have some measure of success. This with our fingers crossed. Knowing full well that this is certainly out of our category as alcoholics, also something they often say, we don't understand those people, right? We don't understand them. This is out of our category as alcoholics. We have decided upon a program based on the AA book and its principles, but substituting the word narcotic for the word alcoholic. The proposed model, an independent fellowship with no connection to AA. Now, this is what Bill supported. This is the one he was all about. So Bill replies to Jack now. Congratulations upon the narcotics project. This is a subject which interests me immensely. There's no doubt that in time the AA message will filter over into these poor devils and liberate a great many of them. There's no doubt, is there, poor devils? So here we are, here and there throughout.
The tape's sort of messed up here, so I'm going to reread some of this. Here and there, throughout AA, we find really severe narcotic cases that have been rehabilitated by AA. But in practically every instance, they were alcoholics before they became addicts, which again is a core tenet of Bill Wilson's. Alcoholics can help alcoholics, addicts can help addicts. Alcoholics can help addicts if they're also alcoholics. We're not so sure about this. Alcoholics can help addicts do it. Probably the best source of information is the Narcotics Hospital at Lexington, Kentucky, which I'm glad to see you plan to contact. Some members of the local AA, some of them former addicts, I believe, have been working inside the Lexington institution with slow but tangible results. Their experience indicates that the addict who was formerly an alcoholic can transmit straight to the addict himself. So let's go back to the live tape.
Straight to the addict himself, to an addict, that is, who was never an alcoholic. However, that doesn't mean you people in LA can't jump the gap. Isn't that, I mean, it's like he's imagining like electricity moving from, and I think that's, something like that is true. You know, we've got something we can convey to each other. And so he's saying, I'm not sure that you have the proper conductor, though, when you have an alcoholic over here and an addict over there. That was his question. You know, you might be able to jump the gap. That is, an alcoholic carry the message to an addict. I certainly think you ought to try, though I agree it should not be in the least under AA's auspices. So he held firm on this, and probably to all of our benefit, right? He said, you guys, we're not going to play any, what do you call it, intellectual property games with you or anything like that. We're going to give you our steps and traditions. You want to adapt them, you adapt them, but we think you should do it. We don't think we should mix it all together as one thing. That was his thing all along. But check this out. For some reason hard to fathom, alcoholics do not care for addicts. And addicts as a class disdain us. They think we're gutter snipes. I was a little offended that I thought we were the gutter snipes. Another difficulty you'll have is this. Apparently, morphine and its derivatives does such, I think you meant to say, like terrible things to the honesty department that it's hard to get a sound moral area into which the AA program can be introduced. We are really just that damaged. Dope has made these otherwise fine people so phony that it's hard to make them together. You know, I'm going to defend him a little bit here because nobody's ever seen this yet. Nobody's ever seen this room at that time. You know, and what they saw was what we now call the tired old life. What they saw is what we look at as Danny sees right up until he started his NA thing. You know, so that's the way it looked to them. But I was told years ago that if an addict were confined for, say, 6 months to a year, then the moral faculties would return in many cases. At this point, they would be quite amenable to the AA approach. So one of the difficulties you'll encounter is that of insulating these people from narcotics long enough for them to regain their sanity so that AA can be given to them. So you can see in some of the early treatments for addicts, you can see Synanon in this, right? Yeah, like, no, you can't, you gotta go hold them down behind some kind of locked doors and give them some time, and then maybe you can do something. But you remember what Jimmy K had to say about that a few years later?
Yeah.
We believe that the sooner we face our problems, well, you read it. Jimmy was calling bullshit on your behalf, you know. But let's also say some of that was true. For some people, that's true, right? Well, we're not saying that's never true. That somebody needs to be kind of isolated and kept from the drugs, and it takes a long time. And okay, I'm not arguing that that's never true, but nor would I argue that's always true. And that's kind of what was being argued, I think. Okay, so for a decade now, Bill has been sparring with these people. He's writing to. If you've looked at the correspondence between him and Betty T, him and Lynn, him and others, he's getting a little tired of this now. And he puts his foot down and addresses it formally. Bill writes Problems Other Than Alcohol in 1958. This was initially a Grapevine article, later made into a pamphlet that's still available in AA groups today. Here's a snippet. Our first duty as a society is to ensure our own survival. Therefore, we have to avoid distractions and multi-purpose activity. An AA group as such cannot take on all the personal problems of its members, let alone the problems of the whole world. Sobriety, freedom from alcohol, through the teaching and practice of the 12 steps, is the sole purpose of an AA group. Groups have repeatedly tried other activities and they've always failed. It's also been learned that there is no possible way to make non-alcoholics into AA members. We have to combine our membership to alcoholics, and we have to combine our AA groups to a single purpose. If we don't stick to these principles, we shall almost surely collapse, and if we collapse, we cannot help anyone. This is sort of like the whole rationale for the traditions, right? We need to keep ourselves focused on what we do and not take on anything else. So he was sort of laying down the law here. Enough with this, can we do addicts in AA? But I want you to put a pin in this phrase: sobriety, dash, freedom from alcohol, dash. We'll get back to this, but he's establishing a premise here and the definition of the term. So in the 80s, I don't know when it was, early 80s, because I was still in Fargo. I got clean in Fargo when moved to LA to work for the World Service Office. But this stuff was starting to percolate on the wind in NA. Like, we got to stop saying sobriety or clean and sober or drugs and alcohol, and we need to blah, blah, blah. And I was a little like, really? Are we starting to play semantics now? Is this getting a little bit sort of tribal now, and some of the answer to all those things is yes. But another answer to those things is, and yet there was an underlying rationale. So let's go there. This was from a pamphlet that I found on the AA shelves at that time. I think it's been rewritten, but it still says this. It's generally accepted that the misuse of prescription medication and other drugs can threaten the achievement and maintenance of sobriety. I remember staring at that for a bit and saying, okay, so if I overdo my prescription, I haven't lost my sobriety, but I could threaten it by that practice. But if I could smoke some weed, but that might threaten my sobriety. So this word starts to fall into disfavor among our members. Like, if that's what it means, then maybe we got to say it some other way. So there's Jimmy. Yes. Jimmy got clean in AA in 1950. Just a couple of things about Jimmy. Jimmy, we often call the founder of AA. We consider him the founder of NA. He never did, however. He always said that it was a group effort that founded NA. And there's all kinds of evidence for that it wasn't a single founder. But I'm ready to kind of make the case it's still legit. We can't let go of him. We've never been able to let go of him. I say it's still legit that we use that term for him, and I'll tell you why as I move forward here. Here's some copies of handwritten notes from the first NA organizational meetings in '53. That's Jimmy's name. There was a sign-in sheet. October of 1953. These weren't like an NA recovery meeting, probably. This sign-in sheet was probably the people getting together to kind of put this thing together. And by the way, in Bob Stone's book, and in Jimmy's 20th anniversary talk, in both of those places, they talk about, there was an Addicts Anonymous meeting in the Valley at that time. There was a Narcotics Anonymous meeting in the Valley at that time. Not a fellowship, but there was a meeting. And part of what was happening here is they were consolidating it all and saying, let's not have multiple things. Let's create something. So that's why we really call this the founding. They rolled these ill-defined things together and said, let's have something. And they did this kind of serious focus on it. So on October 5th, 1953, they held the first meeting of this. Or at least the first meeting after these organizational meetings. This had previously appeared in the Key out of Lexington, so there's that connection. And here's what it says. This is a purpose statement for Narcotics Anonymous at our first meeting. Our precepts are patterned after those of Alcoholics Anonymous, to which all credit is given and precedence is acknowledged. We claim no originality, but since we believe that the cause of alcoholism and addiction are basically the same, we wish to apply to our lives the truths and principles which have benefited so many otherwise helpless individuals. We believe that by so doing, we may regain and maintain our health and sanity. So that was the purpose statement. But just put a pin in this one too. Now this is us now. This isn't someone else. We believe that the causes of alcoholism and addiction are basically the same. So we're saying there's two things. Alcoholism is one thing, addiction is another thing. In our earliest kind of formulation of our thinking. In 1959, NA briefly dies. There was a personality clash throughout the 50s between a guy named Cy M and Jimmy. Cy was not much on the traditions. He wanted to start a nationwide network of clinics for addicts. He does full face and name interviews. He calls himself the founder. Jimmy starts to, he loses some interest in the whole project at that point. And he was committed to the traditions, but he rarely attends later in the 50s. And everyone stopped attending in 1959, and the meeting folded. So that's kind of a famous moment in our history where we had some challenges of ourselves applying to traditions, disagreement whether we wanted to apply the traditions, and the meeting folds. Jimmy hears this, and with others, he starts the meeting at Rhodes and Moore Park in Studio City in 1960. And I'm betting there are people in this room who have been to that meeting. I've been to that meeting. Before it folded, when I was living in LA in the 80s.
I resigned one time as chairman of NA before I really got going again because of the very thing I'm talking about. I resigned because we were not following the traditions of Narcotics Anonymous. Because actually, although we had meetings going for several years, about 4 years, there was no Narcotics Anonymous. Because one of the things we said that we would call ourselves an NA organization and fellowship as long as we used the steps and the traditions. So when we stopped using the traditions and it became a one-man rule proposition, there was no longer really any NA. So in other words, there was no NA left. So I went in and Sylvia came in, I told her what happened, and she started to cry, And she said, "Oh my God, what are we going to do, Jimmy?" I'll tell you what we're going to do. We're going to have to go back to what we started with in 1953 when we first sat down to try to put something together to help addicts. You and I are going to have to live the steps the way we do, and we're going to have to follow the traditions all the way because we've died because the traditions have not been lived up to, and you know it as well as I do. She says, "Yeah." I said, "Are you willing?" I got to have a program. I can't go to AA. I can't make it in AA. I said, neither can a lot of people, I said, okay, let's start all over again then. We'll still call it Narcotics Anonymous, and we'll try to live up to the thing.
And so we did. Now that guy sounded a little bit like a founder, didn't he? This is kind of why at some point Jimmy stepped in the role. True, he wasn't a sole founder of the thing from the beginning, but he stepped in the role at some point, and throughout it, always said, "No, I'm not the founder," but yet he was in that leadership role. So they started their meeting on Rhodes and Moore Park, the first to include a meeting of the 12 traditions. So here's from the meeting format there. It contains the 12 traditions down here. Notice it says 1960. So this looks to me like it's probably the first format when they came back, but it's a little kind of interesting. They had read the steps up here. They scratched it out. I don't know why. It's just point of curiosity. Maybe they did it another way or something. Read the 12 traditions, if time permits. Written in later, sometime later. They go. Maybe they're, like some people don't like. Why are we reading the traditions at every meeting? And this history here makes a pretty good case of why we keep them fresh in our minds. But anyway, they might have been dealing with that too. Who knows? And then notice the name of this meeting. Architects of Adversity. Some people in this room are familiar with that name. There's a little ripple of applause you hear there because there's a Zoom meeting 7 days a week that has this name. I think this is probably a little bit. That must be a little nod back to these guys for our history. And at the end of the meeting, the leader will read the 12 traditions. So the 12 traditions are now firmly ensconced, and from that 1959 day, they've never again faded away. NA has never again faded out like it did at that point. On the decades for a second. And in the 60s, I would say the key theme was literature, and NA begins to grow. We got who is an addict, what is the NA program, how it works, why are we here, what can I do, and the 12 traditions, not written but sort of formally in the picture, in the literature in the 1960s. And the Little White Book came out in 1962. This book contains all those meeting readings, including the traditions. And this becomes what I term a seed pod of an NA meeting or community getting out into the world. And I am a beneficiary of this. In 1970, early 1970s, maybe something like 1970s, somebody from Fargo, where I was living and using and having my being, some guy went to Northern California and ended up he went there to help build a prison. He used to tell this story, really funny. I went there to help build a prison, and as soon as we were done building it, I was one of the first ones to occupy it. I don't know what prison would have been being built then. Maybe you guys could figure that out, give the Fargo people some of their own history. But anyway, he ended up coming out of that prison in Northern California with a Little White Book in his pocket. And he goes back to Fargo with that thing. And I found that meeting in 78. And my wife, Teresa, found that meeting in 78. So meetings began to start in various cities, mostly in California in the 60s. Perhaps 20 meetings by the end of the decade. 20. And I don't know about that number. That's the number I found. Sometimes, like they say, sometimes history ain't what it used to be. Like you thinking about that? Sometimes it shifts and changes and we learn new things. But that's what I'm seeing, about 20 meetings by the end of the 60s. The 70s, they start thinking about putting together services, and then it starts to grow. This is a letter from 1971 from the Board of Trustees proposing a November conference. This letter, in my opinion, or my read of it, I don't know, is the birth of the World Convention, the World Service Office, the World Service Conference, which was at first more like an area meeting, kind of, with a worldwide vision. So let's just read just a little snippet from it. The principal purpose of this conference is to get together delegates from NA groups in all localities, both in the U.S. and in other countries. This is 71. I don't know. Maybe that's a vision. Maybe there's a little, the seed pod is starting to sprout, somewhere. To establish an NA World Central Office and elect paid full-time business manager to be in charge of this office. So the conference, the office, the board, what did I say? Conference, the office, and the World Convention, because they're doing it all at a convention. They kind of combine the conference and convention in the early days. So then they wrote the NA Tree in 1975, which is considered the first service manual envisioning a service structure for NA. It was written before such a structure really existed. The conference that was held in 76 was considered the first because it was the first held within this new structure. So I got that little piece of information from Jack Bernstein one time, because I used to say, okay, they said they started in 71, and they did, but now they say the 76 is the first one, so I don't know. And Jack comes up to me afterwards, he said, 71 we did meet, 72, 3, 4, 5 we did meet. But when we finally put together the tree, we had a structure, we had a thing now, and this was the first conference of that thing, so that's why. And then we also started getting pamphlets on the tables in the 70s. First little start of translations was in the 70s with the German White Book. Jimmy kind of had a special fondness for the base in Germany, the Americans who were on the base in Germany, and there was people there, sort of like now where you get expats or someplace. They start an NA meeting for themselves, and then they start trying to spread it within the place that they live, and that was happening in Germany this far back. So there was a little bit of translations going on. In the 80s, you really have to say in the 80s that the big deal is the basic text. The basic text hits in 1982. It was completed in 1982, passed by the conference, and it resulted in explosive growth and international development. By the end of the 80s, there was none of this question anymore. It was taken off all over the world. And the other thing that I'm going to say the 80s is characterized for is this little phrase that we call the NA philosophy of recovery, that we were calling it that back then. And so I'll delve into that as I go here. But these are just, now this is, I'm not going to go into any great depth on this because that's what Boyd and Chris are going to do tomorrow. But these are the first two flyers for the World Lit Conference. Just to say, as you'll hear in much more detail tomorrow, this was not a project that was started by Jimmy in the World Service Office and then they got people involved. No, this was an uprising that happened on the East Coast, where people said, we need a book. And if you're not going to write a book, we're going to write a book. That's basically where that started. And then they kind of synced it up and became the World Lit Committee, and it was a kind of peaceable truces throughout. But it was an uprising. That's the way I would put it. And these are a couple more of them, and I just want to point out that they're wrestling with language a little bit here, with gratitude in our cleanliness. They're trying to figure out if we're not going to use language that doesn't really suit us, what language are we going to use? And this is the one that said that there was the Memphis conference, and at that Memphis conference they took that issue on in a big way, and I'll show you a bit about that later. We want a book. We want our book. How about you? This was the tone of everything they were doing at that time, and I was clean during this. I was getting their letters, reading their reports, and it was interesting, but you kind of doubted. This band of fucking hippies is gonna write us a book. So just being honest. But they came up with a draft. They had 7 of these conferences, maybe 9, depending on what you count as a conference. And they put together these drafts and they brought them to the World Service Conference in 1982. So now, first thing I want to point out on this is that character. Anybody recognize that? That's Steve Weiss. Steve Weiss was the chair of the conference that year, the year that the basic text was approved. And of course, where's Waldo? If you show any picture of any significance in NA history, Bob Barrett's going to be in the picture probably. There's Bob Barrett. Okay, but here's what was on the board at the moment, and you could, I'm sure, cut the air with a knife at this moment. To accept the basic text approval form as the first edition of the Narcotics Anonymous book. So that was the moment, and I should say it wasn't crystal clear. I don't know, Bob, were you in that room?
Yes, he was.
Were you? Was it crystal clear that this motion was going to pass, or did
It wasn't crystal clear, but it was jubilant when it did.
Okay, he said not crystal clear, but when we're going to see the jubilant, he said jubilant when it did, but part of the jubilant when it did was the not crystal clear, because I remember back where I came from, if we weren't so sure, is this the right one book? Is it okay.
I would like to make a motion to accept the basic text approval form as the first edition of our Narcotics Anonymous book.
It's been moved and seconded. All in favor of accepting the basic text approval form as the first edition of our Narcotics Anonymous book, please stand.
And this was the result over the next 20 years. In 80, that video was shot in 82. This slide starts in 83. There were 3,000 NA meetings in the world in 83. It's over 30,000 20 years later. So the basic text really was a rocket ship as far as the fellowship growth went.
At this point, there was another huge gap in the original audio. So I'll just pick it up a little bit here. On this slide, I was talking about how the basic text produced such rapid growth. About 10 times, our fellowship grew about 10 times the size in 20 years. And then I take a look at why there were 5 editions and 1 revision of the basic text in 6 years, just to try to give a quick overview of this piece of our history. The approval draft was passed at the 1982 conference, which we just watched, to be published by early 1983. Before publishing it as the first edition in 83, the approval draft was changed by some trusted servants without conference approval. They explained why in a letter to the fellowship. This was the first edition, 1983. So they made some changes to language. It was done in good faith, but it was also done amid some controversy about whether they should do it and some strong objection to them doing it. But they believed that the fellowship would support them. It was not a universally accepted decision. In response, the presses were stopped and it was changed back to the original manuscript. This was the second edition, also 1983. The World Service Conference then took up the issue with the groups and sent them a form to vote on the changes that had previously been made. The changes passed. The groups had objected to the process, not the substance of the change, though the Lid Committee objected to both. It was changed again, and this was the third edition, 1984. The fellowship then began to request some updates to the little white book, which we'll examine in a minute. The trustees spent 1985 studying this and recommending a whole set of changes. These were passed at the 1986 conference. Because the italicized intros of the main basic text chapters were taken directly from the little white book, the basic text was also updated with the new language, along with the main meeting readings. This was the third edition revised, passed in 1986. Happy with this, the 1986 conference said, let's do the same thing with the whole basic text. The charge was to clean up any grammatical, punctuation, and slight wording issues. An editor was hired to complete this work. The conference felt that this could simply be published when ready, rather than coming back for approval. And this was done, and I think I said during the original presentation, what could go wrong? This was the fourth edition, 1986 to 87, and I put it that way because it didn't happen at a conference. It happened when it was ready during that conference year and was just made available to the fellowship. But the editing had resulted in many errors. There were entire paragraphs missing, and the conference felt that the edit had gone way beyond what they had requested. A new editor was hired with the instructions to clean up the errors and make the editing much lighter. This passed at the next conference. This was the fifth edition, 1987. And after all those changes in such a short time, the conference passed a 5-year moratorium on further changes to the basic text in 1988. The mood in the room give it a rest already. People were so frustrated and tired of, let's stop fighting over our book and our language and let's just establish this as our basic text for at least 5 years. So the moratorium expired at the end of that 5-year period and was renewed 2 more times for a total moratorium of 15 years. When it came up again in 2003, the moratorium was not renewed, leaving the possibility open for a 6th edition. The fellowship was surveyed and held discussions over the next few years about what, if any, changes they wanted or were open to. The results? Leave the main 10 chapters alone, swap out some or all of the stories, add a new preface with updated info on the fellowship and the basic text. All of this was done, and the 6th edition was approved unanimously. 5 stories were kept. The rest were replaced and new ones were added. This was a major effort to capture the diversity of our worldwide fellowship. It was the first time stories were included that had been written in other languages and translated to English. And I'll resume the original audio.
In other languages and translated into English. So it's kind of a big milestone for an international fellowship to now changed as a result of the 6th edition. In the past, other language groups could publish the basic text without the stories, and most did. So if you see the basic text in French, whatever, it doesn't have any stories in it. So they're dealing with kind of a slightly different basic text than we are, because to edit these American guys' stories might not be the intended effect for the people in France, you know. So now they're expected to translate, quote, some or all of the stories. So we all work from the basic text. And the only reason we went with some or all at that time was that if fellowship, let's say someplace in the Middle East, has an objection to one of the stories, not that they personally have an objection, but they say our culture, this won't wash in our culture, this story. So we said, let's leave that kind of discretion to the local fellowship. So you take some or all, but translate the stories in addition to translating the first part of the basic text. So now let's get back to our pins. I said we were going to revisit these phrases. Sobriety, freedom from alcohol. And our own one, we believe that the causes of alcoholism and addiction are basically the same. 2 different things, basically the same causes. Here's AA's first step. We admitted we were powerless over alcohol, that our lives had become unmanageable. NA's first step. We admitted that we were powerless over our addiction, that our lives had become unmanageable. This is the only really, or the one really significant innovation in the language of the NA step. We have built our foundation as a fellowship on this turn of phrase here. It represents a shift from powerlessness over the specific drug, powerless over this, to powerless over this, and this, and powerless over the disease of addiction. And pretty significant change and a different sort of surrender.
It took a long time for me to understand what addiction was about, really. I read the steps 1,000 times, but I never really knew the true impact of what my addiction was about, It's constantly creeping up, when things of a nature of, I get that gratification or that feeling good or it looks good and I want to run with it. I'm still into that. And I catch myself, well, here I go again. Running crazy because something made me feel good, or it looked good and it's worthwhile running it to the ground until I get, I actually get sick about it. I think one of the things we come in here with, I think we talk about many things, but I think when we get to understanding the true nature, or when I get to understand my true nature of my disease, how all-encompassing it is, it's a whole me. My very being is just addictive.
Man, I miss that guy.
Yeah.
So basically, what Bob's describing there is powerless over that. The NA philosophy of recovery. Let me just try to put it in a nugget here. Again, this is a phrase on the wind. I don't think this is documented anywhere. I don't think that there's any official anything about this. Except I'm standing up here saying I was right in the middle of all this, and this phrase was being used a lot to try to describe what was going on. The major conceptual issues in terms of the NA program, the NA philosophy of recovery, de-emphasize the mention of specific drugs, emphasize instead the addiction experience itself per step one, identify at the deeper levels of feeling and experience. So you kind of drive the identification down a level deeper. Beneath which drug did I use, and what was my relationship with that drug like, and what was my experience with that wrestling match? That's basically where it starts. We have one disease with different drugs and other compulsions seen as symptoms, not as separate diseases. This was crystallizing in the 80s. This is how we think of our addiction and our recovery process. Other manifestations of addiction are not treated as outside issues. And that, I've seen that happen, let's say in an AA meeting where somebody shares about their gambling or something. Or you're sharing about your drugs. It's an outside issue. Those things are not outside issues when we admit that we're powerless over our addiction, right? It manifests here, it manifests there. It's a fucking whack-a-mole, it manifests there. And we can talk about that. Okay, so let's jump back to the 1981 Lit conference where they were trying to write the basic text, and they sat down and they said, what they were dealing with at the time is they were saying, we start talking about it and we realize these guys are talking about being chemically dependent, which was the term of the treatment world of the day. That someone else is saying, I'm a dope fiend and a juicer, and someone else says, I'm a junkie and and everybody's trying to out-color everybody else with what you were. And so they're saying, but we're trying to write a book here. We're trying to capture our experience. What are we? And what do we suffer from? And so they actually built a glossary right here. They said, when you want to say the condition of being abstinent or sober or whatever, say clean. So they weren't talking about how you should share at a meeting at this point. They were talking about what we should write in our book. How do we get that down? Identify identity as powerless over chemicals. Call it, in other words, who am I? I'm an addict. And I remember the first time sitting in an NA meeting and we're going around and introducing ourselves. Every single person said, I'm an addict. It was like a victory. Wow, we're getting past this kind of hodgepodge thing that we had sort of inherited here and inherited there, and we're creating our own thing here. So now the Fellowship magazine, when they were done with the basic text, they immediately created a magazine. And it was being done by volunteers of a committee of the World Service Conference. And they were asking people to write in. And this issue of language started to be being taken up in that magazine. More than just what are we going to write in the book, but how should we share at meetings? What is the message that we're carrying? And you know and I know that was not handled particularly well in some places and with some people. That, like when you're trying to make a change like that and you do it by shaming and finger wagging and ostracizing, it's just so stupid. But the underlying principles that were being brought into the world at that time in the form of our fellowship were not stupid. So let's just look at that. I'm just going to read one of those articles that came up in the NA Way magazine. Much care and hard work within our literature movement has gone into developing our own language with regard to our disease and our recovery process. This was done because in NA we've taken on the task of broadening the perspective of the 12 steps to include addiction to all all mind-altering, mood-changing drugs. We've changed the language to take the focus off the drugs entirely and place the focus on the addiction itself and the recovery process. That does, in fact, set us apart. No one else was doing this. Everyone else was creating a fellowship based on their drug, or that drug, or generically drugs. To keep the focus clear, we must use NA language at NA meetings. That way we can keep our doors as open as possible to exactly those whom our traditions target. Now, this is no edict coming down from anybody. This is somebody sharing in the magazine, right? But with each other. We introduce ourselves at meetings as addicts and nothing else. That includes us all, excludes no appropriate people, sets no one apart as different, and is the only term used in our basic text. Rather than the words sober or sobriety, which imply freedom from alcohol, yet do not accurately describe freedom from any other substances, we use the words clean, recovery, clean time. So you can see this was taking shape in the form of our written dialogue with each other. But so the next one here, though, came from the Board of Trustees. The Board of Trustees decided to say something about this in the newsline. And they wrote an article, and I'll just excerpt it here. From very early on, AA was confronted by a perplexing problem. What do we do with drug addicts? We want to keep our focus on alcohol, so the alcoholic hears the message. But these addicts come in here talking about drugs, inadvertently weakening our atmosphere of identification. But the problem, now this one is kind of important, it seems to me, but the problem that AA wished to avoid would have to be addressed by any group who tried to adapt their principles for drug addicts. Can someone with a heroin or problem relate to someone with an alcohol or marijuana or Valium problem? How will you ever achieve the unity that the first tradition says is necessary for recovery? Our fellowship inherited a tough dilemma. So this is in a sense, it's all respect back to Bill Wilson, right? It's saying he may have had a point, that if you just try to focus on the drug, and you focus on your drug, and you focus on your drug, and we put us all in the room, we're creating this volatile mix where nobody quite relates to each other. But if you kind of remove that layer of it and go to, you got your wrestling match with your drug, I've got my wrestling match with my drug, etc., you find that point of identification. Rather than converting the first step in the most natural, logical way, we admit we're powerless over drugs, because if they're saying we admit we're powerless over that, then we say we admit we're powerless over these. Instead, our founders made a radical change. They wrote, we admit we're powerless over our addiction. When addicts gather and focus on drugs, they're usually focusing on their differences, because each of us used a different drug or combination of drugs. The one thing that we all share is the disease of addiction. It was a masterful stroke. With that single turn of a phrase, the foundation of the NA fellowship was laid. So that was the trustees speaking to the fellowship. Maybe we should adopt this way of holding our first step through language. This became Bulletin 13, which is still on NA.org today.
My very being is just addictive. My very being is just addictive.
Especially with that look, right? Okay. But what should we do about our literature published before the basic text, which sometimes used language that was not consistent with the NA philosophy of recovery? Because now we have it in our little white book all over the place. Work began in 1985 to examine the little white book in this light and for any other issues that need to be addressed. The result was the third edition revised. This was an extensive edit, as I already said, in the meeting readings, the basic text. So let's look at some of the changes made. Second to the last paragraph of it works prior to 86. The only way to keep from getting or continuing a habit is not to take that first fixed pill or drink. And I was in this room too. I was listening to the trustees have this debate. So was Tom McCall, who's sitting over here. They started going down the track. Well, should we say fix, pill, drink, snort, toke? Where does it stop? And to what extent are we just using slang that's going to be outdated, and the new slang won't be able. They changed it to the only way to keep from returning to active addiction is to not take that first drug. And then that thing in the end where we release our addiction all over again or create a new one, they just removed or create a new one. So if we have one addiction, it has many appetites, and it's a whack-a-mole, but it's not different diseases every time something else pops up. The substitution of alcohol, I think this is the change in the Little White Book that was most called for and probably most significant. The substitution of alcohol has caused a great many, I'm making some people in this room nostalgic now of the old language. The substitution of alcohol has caused a great many addicts to form a new addiction pattern, which in its progression brings as many problems as before. We seem to forget that alcohol is one of the oldest known drugs. It would appear that we are people with addictive personalities who are strongly susceptible to alcoholic addiction. So is that what we are? Addictive personalities, and we're susceptible to alcoholic addiction, or are we addicts and don't drink alcohol as part of our principle of total abstinence? So this was changed to just thinking of alcohol as different from other drugs has caused a great many addicts to relapse. Before we came to NA, many of us viewed alcohol separately, but we cannot afford to be confused about this. Alcohol is a drug. We are people with the disease of addiction who must abstain from all drugs in order to recover. Just clarified our NA philosophy of recovery in kind of one paragraph there. The second paragraph of why are we here? Most of us realize that in our addictions, plural, we were slowly committing suicide, but such cunning enemies of life are narcotics and sedation that we had lost the power to do anything about it. Now that one, I have to admit, when we were working on this one, I felt a little pang of we're taking some poetry out here. Such cunning enemies of life are narcotics and sedation. But they're mentioning a specific drug, a specific type of drugs, and it's not really what we do. It's not consistent with what we do. The jail, look at this. Jail did not help us at all. Medicine, religion, and psychiatry seem to have no answers for us that we could use. All these methods having failed for us in desperation, we sought help from each other in Narcotics Anonymous. And in the room there, the objection was, this is a bit of an overstatement. It's a bit of an overreach. Yeah, maybe jail wasn't the answer. Maybe medicine, religion, and psychiatry didn't get it done for us. But do we want to say in our literature that we're putting in all those places no answers for us that we can use? So they rewrote that. Many of us realized that in our addiction, we were slowly committing suicide. But addiction is such a cunning enemy of life. So just put it right on the basic, what NA is kind of trying to crystallize here. And then it says, many of us ended up in jail or sought help through medicine, religion, and psychiatry. None of these methods was sufficient for us. That's kind of a nice reframing of that phrase. Our disease always resurfaced or continued to progress until in desperation. So now you have that NA philosophy of recovery showing up much clearer. Okay, for the first paragraph, what is the NA program? There is only one requirement for membership, the honest desire to stop using. There are no musts in NA, but we suggest that you keep an open mind and give yourself a break. Both of those two bold things there were constant sources of people going, why do we say honest desire? It doesn't say honest desire in the tradition, and blah, blah, and there are no musts in NA, well, unless you want to stay clean, that kind of stuff. So they basically said there is only one requirement for membership, the desire to stop using. We suggest you keep an open mind and give yourself a break. Here's a side note for extra credit now. Honest desire was never in any version of our traditions, as some people say. That change was made here, not in the tradition itself. And for deep extra credit, that change was made in the AA third tradition when in 1949 they went from the long form to the short form of the tradition. So they had their little honest desire and controversy and debate. They settled it in the short form of the traditions. We inherited the short form of the traditions, but then in our what is the NA program? We put it in there in the text, but we took it out in 86. From the second paragraph of what is the NA program, anyone may join us regardless of age, race, color, creed, or lack of religion. Anybody missing from that list?
Sexual identity. Sexual identity.
Yeah, no mention of sexual minorities. And this is 1985, so this was a time of homophobia, is it fair to say? And, the AIDS crisis and everything else that was going on. But in that room was John Farrell, who was a gay man, who was a brilliant man, extremely articulate man, not a shy man. And he took this on. First of all, the question of race and color, is that a redundancy? Maybe we could make a little room there for somebody else, and we did this. Anyone may join us regardless of age, race, sexual identity, creed, religion, or lack of religion. But not just that we added the sexual minority, I'll call it, but that they debated how to add it. They said, okay, how about sexual preference? That gets it done, Shane, right? No, he said no. Sexual preference. You can imagine John's reaction when they're debating sexual preference. It's not a preference, no blah, blah. The sexual orientation. That seemed better, like that. But John was still going, but that's still leaving people out. In 1985, I'm telling you, he says that's still leaving people out. There are people for whom the issue is identity. And we didn't have even the words gender identity, at least in anything I'd ever seen by then. But John is introducing this, and he won that argument. And we got the phrase sexual identity instead of, which he said would sort of cover it all, which I thought, now we're having that discussion again. Okay, I'll tell you this. A drought of book-length literature followed the publishing of the basic text, but not for lack of trying. We wanted so bad, we were sort of like ready to clone some more AA stuff, but do our own thing with it. Like, let's have a 12 and 12, which became It Works How and Why. We did our own thing with Just for Today, which was a daily meditation. They didn't have a daily meditation at that time. They do now, but they did not then. Hazelden was carrying that ball for them. But see, how do you do it is the question. This thing about we write our own literature at the grassroots, that's how we write literature. That was our thing. So local communities were encouraged to form lit committees and generate input, and much was generated for a daily meditation book and a Steps and Traditions book. But no drafts combining this input into a coherent book felt acceptable enough to submit for approval. We could not get a book into the conference for approval because we couldn't figure out how. During that time, we were experimenting with process and debating the appropriate roles for the office, the conference, and the local fellowship. We tried using a non-professional writer for It Works at one point in 86, which went very badly and did not pass at the conference. It was the only time that had been tried. Let me put a fine point on this. No existing literature was written by any non-member professionals, as is sometimes claimed. Some people seem to think that we just hand the project off to a writer, some professional writer writes us, and that's good enough. Never been done. It's never been done. It wasn't even tried that one time, but we did try hiring a non-professional, non-member writer one time, and that it was almost like cowboy poetry or something. It wasn't like that. This is not anyway. This inability to produce any major work went on for almost 10 years. It's like 9 years and something. The questions we were wrestling with were, is the magic of the grassroots process used to write the basic text reproducible as we grow in numbers, diversity, and international spread? For example, how do we include other language groups? Is there a role for writers? What about forever non-professional? Like, if we hire a writer, is that consistent with the age tradition? How can we capture the mature voice and perspective of the growing number of experienced members that we have in our fellowship? How do we do it? And we're just struggling. By about 1990, the staff team approach takes shape and is still used today. A team of special workers, under Tradition 8, people who are hired by the office, it is assembled for each project to perform project management, writing, and editing functions. Writers are always addicts and always very experienced members. Work groups of trusted servants, including one or more world board members, are formed to work closely with the team, the writer-editor team, to collaborate and provide input. And for that grassroots involvement, extensive efforts are made to solicit and include input from the fellowship everywhere throughout the piece's development. And we do it with local workshops being held around the world, NAS running workshops. Individual groups are encouraged to simply send in their members to send in. So we've managed to kind of capture that magic again, the grassroots nature of our literature development writing. So as the 80s came to a close, two things were in place. The message in our existing literature was clear and internally consistent, capturing the NA philosophy of recovery. And two, our process for capturing the experience of our ever-maturing fellowship in new literature had been established in the staff team approach. So when those two things came together, here's what followed. Just for today, it was like we pulled a cork out of it. Just for today in 1991, 12 concepts in 1992, It Works How and Why in 93, Step Working Guides in 98, Sponsorship in 2004, Living Clean in 2012, Guiding Principles in 2019, Spiritual Principle a Day in 2022.
And it's going to take all of me, and it's going to take all of you, and all the people that you're going to talk to, and all the people you're going to carry the message to make this a greater reality. There are people out there dying of our disease. There are people all over this world dying of our disease. And believe it or not, we are truly the only people who can really help them. Let's never forget that. You and I have been given, through illness, through suffering, and through disease, a talent for helping other human beings like ourselves. Let's never forget that we have it, and that we are responsible for others.